So then module 4, so now you've collected your data, whether that be secondary data or primary data. So you've collected your data, you've gotten that data all in, and now let's talk about how do we interpret that data. So making sense of everything that you've already collected. And so it's important to know that interpreting data is an ongoing and iterative process. So you need to review and reevaluate your goals and objectives. So once the data comes in, you might learn things that you didn't think you were going to learn from it, or not be able to do exactly what you wanted to do. So it's an iterative process. You need to constantly be reevaluating. And then also the conditions in your food system are going to change over time. And so that means you're going to have to reevaluate what data it is you need and how you need to use that data. And you need to engage, as I said before, your analyst up front. So you need to have an idea before you have that data, how you're going to analyze it and who's going to analyze it. So questions to pose as you're interpreting the data. What have we learned so far, and how are we going to interpret that data we collected? So what do we know so far? Maybe we've learned some stuff in the process that we didn't know at the very beginning. And so how are we going to use that information that we know so far to help us interpret the data? And what information gaps or data needs remain? So what areas were you not able to capture? Do you not think you have a good handle on? Are there gaps in this data or gaps in the story that you're trying to tell as you interpret this data that you need to do something about? Do you need to go collect some additional information in order to help to answer some of those gaps or fill in some of those gaps? And then also comparative analysis. This is one area where I think secondary data is really nice. You can compare to other regions. You can say, okay, here's what's happening in my region, here's what's happening in other regions, and it's very easy to compare across regions. So look for ways in which your community is unique within a region. So do they have higher than average incomes or expenditures? So how is your community different than neighboring communities? Do you have high rates of rural to urban conversion? So are you having a lot of ag lands converting to urban lands in your community more than neighboring communities? So doing some sort of a comparative analysis and being able to interpret your results in a more regional context. And so I like this chart. So common data pitfalls. First of all, not all changes are significant. So let's say you have a time series of data, and one of them says that $10 million were spent in 2015, and then in 2016, $10.1 million were spent. Well, is that significant? Is that a significant change? Well, it depends on the quality of data and things like that, but just because the numbers aren't exactly the same doesn't mean it's significant. And so it's important to note that. Just because the numbers are the same, or not the same, does not mean they're significant. And also the idea that correlation does not equal causation. So here you can see these two. We have autism in the triangles, and we have organic food sales in the squares. They move together. So does that mean organic sales are causing autism? Probably not. So correlation does not necessarily equal causation. So use some common sense when you're looking at the data.
And just the significance is a technical term in statistics. So you all may be aware of that, but we just want to reiterate that. And that's why having somebody who actually understands how to run a test for significance, for statistical significance, is actually really important on your team, right? Someone who understands how to do that kind of that test.
So let the data speak for itself. Some community meetings can be an ideal place to solicit feedback on areas of interest or importance. So you might think certain things are important, and if you put a good team together that represents the community, well, maybe that's what the community thinks is important as well. But it can be helpful to kind of throw that information out there and have a conversation. What of this is interesting to you? What would you use? How are you going to use it? And it also serves as a way to ground truth it as well. If you throw a number out to the community and they're like, whoa, I know that's not right, it's a good way to ground truth, okay? Either maybe it actually is right, but they've heard that 5% that Becca's been talking about all along, and they know that 5% of food is consumed locally. So maybe your data is right, but you know where the pushback is going to be, or maybe you haven't ground truth. Maybe there were some problems when you were collecting the data. It allows you to look at that information a little more closely and kind of understand where you might get some pushback. And also sharing data is another strategy to key influential partners engaged. So if you've brought a lot of these partners and community members and assembled them in your strategic planning team, well, giving them a little data, giving them some information can be a way to keep them engaged and get them back engaged and giving feedback into the process. You look, okay. So use graphs, charts, maps, infographics. I showed that infographic earlier. I'm going to show some maps here in a second. But putting it in not just those tables. And be prepared for additional data requests. So if you do a good study, you put good information out there that lots of people want to use, be prepared to them to say, but I want to know this too, or can you do this as well? I want this more information. So be prepared and compose a response with a couple key indicators, a couple ideas of where you're going with that. It's better to usually focus on your findings. So it can be hard and overwhelming if you just throw everything at them. Here's all the survey responses. Here's all of the demographic information. Here's everything. It tends to be better to focus on 3 to 5 key issues. And those key issues might be different depending on which stakeholders you're talking to. Leave insignificant findings or unfinished lines of inquiry out of the main report. So again, as Becca was saying, it's important to have somebody that can tell if results are significant or not statistically. Well, if they're not statistically significant, leave those out. And also unfinished lines of inquiry, and compose an executive summary and topic-specific fact sheet. So an overall executive summary, and then you can dig deeper into some of the interesting things you found in individual fact sheets. Tends to be a good way to portray that information out to the community. So I promised you I'd show you a pretty cool map here of somebody that used GIS to really show an interesting story. So I don't know if I have a pointer. I guess I don't need a pointer. So if you look at the graph over here, the darker the color, the higher the percentage of households that don't have a vehicle. So the darker the color, the harder it is for people to get from one place to another, the percentage of households that do not have a vehicle. And then if you look at those blue dots, those are where food establishments are. And if you look at the kind of the blue area around the blue dot, that's a 1/4 of a mile buffer around it. So typically what they think you can walk. And so you'll notice if there's areas that are very dark red, that are not in that little blue circle, these people are not within a 1/4 of a mile of a place to get food, and they have a high percentage of the population that doesn't have a car. So this is a lot of information portrayed in one graph. And you notice this information would be hard to portray and hard to talk about if you didn't have the GIS skills on your team and didn't have somebody that was able to portray this. Do you?
But,
and then also on the other side,
yeah, you're going to tell. So this is done by someone named Samina Raja, who I think does excellent, excellent work in communities. Everyone should look at her stuff. She's from Buffalo. To me, the key piece here, because there's challenges about whether or not these relationships on the right actually matter, but we could get into that later. What she does here is she's very clear about the data she's using, about the definition she's using, right? But it's not in such an overwhelming way. And that's the key piece when we talked about at the beginning, that there's all of these studies that don't really do a great job because they're not transparent. This is very transparent. So you can agree or disagree with whether or not there's a relationship between sort of the car piece and access and all that kind of stuff, but you understand what they're doing. That is, you can't take it for granted because there's a lot of these studies that don't do a good job with that.
Thanks, Becca. So craft a narrative. So highlight your local projects along some hard data, maybe some data for other communities, maybe related to, okay, here's our local project, this is what's happening locally, this is what's happening regionally. Highlight some good stories from stakeholder interviews. So this is where having qualitative information can be really helpful. If you can tell a story, sometimes people relate a lot better to a story than a number. So if you can, craft a narrative around it. Don't only show them, don't only show them this image here, but craft a narrative around it. Tell the story of what you found, what this means, what people were saying about this information. And use your community engagement process to identify recommendations and actionable items. So use your community to help form your recommendations and actions that should be taken from this information that you've collected. And be aware of the inherent group biases. So there's always going to, no matter how much you follow Module 1 and you're really good about creating your team, there are going to be inherent biases. And owning those biases and understanding what those biases are really important to being to having a good study. And I got 5 minutes for discussion. So after this, we're going to move on this afternoon to modules, the later modules. So are there any questions about these kind of framing and assessment, data collection, basic data interpretation before we move on to this afternoon stuff, or this after 10:30 stuff?
Just elaborate on the issue of significance.
Yeah.
And if in y'all's work on primary data collection, is there ever any situation where it's okay to report non-significant data?
So his question was, is it ever okay to report not significant data? And do you have
I'm going to get a little social sciencey here, but I won't get too far.
But as long as you,
Go ahead,
go
you
for it.
finish. Well, okay.
everybody wants to hear Dave.
No, you don't.
Hold it down because it's really loud.
Really loud, and I use my teacher voice. Tests of significance are normally supposed to be applied when you have a adequate sample of a population that you know. And your test of significance tells you the confidence that you have that a certain result relative to your sample, randomly drawn, is representing your population. So when we hear many people use the word significance and even significance tests inappropriately because they don't have a random sample of a population. So that's where we are in social sciences. We're kind of strict with regard to when a test of significance is used. Oftentimes, as she said though, you have a population that you're studying, but it's not necessarily, well, you have a group of people that you're studying that may or may not reflect the overall population, they're your group. In that case, you can report your findings relative to how you've defined your group. You can report your findings and say 15% said this and 5% said that, da, 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 da. What you don't say is that this reflects the views of the farmers of North Carolina or something like that. It reflects the views of some subset that we tried to define and we studied. So the use of the word significance in social sciences, it gets used too much and too badly. And so I always say, well, don't use the word significant. Use the word important or meaningful, and get rid of that word and actually just start talking about what am I learning from my group that I'm studying, whether it is a representative sample or not, and what does this do for my either process or my product or my research thing. But using tests of significance and p-values, be careful with that. It's just, oftentimes it's used incorrectly, and some people will go crazy when they see bad numbers, and like me.
May or may not be related. You had talked about not using online surveys, and I understand that for economic data. As someone who's used a lot of online surveys, seemingly successfully as far as number of responses, but never asked for economic data. So my question is, I mean, are y'all totally against online surveys for other purposes?
No.
So you could ask qualitative information, but I guess it's never going to be a random sample, right?
Well, no. Huh?
We gave you an online survey.
We gave you, no, and that's the problem. That's a perfect example. It's the people who have the capacity to respond to an online survey. It is not the, quote, population. So your population is the people who had access to your survey within a period of time. Of course you can report those statistics, and you can get quantitative information from those people because it is of a group of self-interested people. You just have to be careful about generalizing the information. Don't give it legs that ain't got. Okay?
But sometimes you know, like I may have asked in a not online of a certain population of farmers, how many of y'all, have internet access? So that's not the issue.
Yeah.
So, but still doesn't mean, because the whole population has internet access, so that's not limiting them. It's still, not everyone's going to answer it. So
And it's still not a random choice.
Right, a random can
Because
only be.
it's not a random choice. You're not sampling the population.
They're
You're-
self-selecting.
Oh, so Dave's answering a question about if you are targeting with an internet survey, you are targeting a specific population, so it's not a random sample. In terms of the internet question and whether or not you should use, or if there's appropriate times for internet surveys, absolutely. So Becky pointed out that we interviewed all of you, right, to get those pieces at the beginning, the Qualtrics survey. And if you think about it, look at all the people in this room. Now you're all, professionals who are working in, food systems, and we had 18 respondents, right? So there's a few more than 18 of you here. So I mean, right, exactly. And so, right. So response rates are, notoriously low, and actually in our discipline they're getting even lower. So response rates are just continuing to go down. People have fatigue. I'm doing a project right now where I'm surveying U.S. Department of Agriculture employees. For that, we tested it, calling people and having them fill it out online so that we could actually test it. We are now going to do an internet-based survey because we think that there's an incentive for those folks based on their jobs, their positions, to fill out an online survey. But it's easier, it's cheaper, there's lots of reasons, right? It does all of the analysis, it's in an Excel spreadsheet. I mean, these things are great. The software is fantastic now, but just because it's cheaper and easier is not a good reason to take that route. And I think especially when you start to see the kinds of information that we need to do these economic impact assessments, you'll see that you really, maybe someone's going to have better luck than I have, but I've done a number of these now and supported a number of groups, and I've never seen anybody get good information from an online survey. In this regard. Right. In this sort of economic, and from farmer populations.
My favorite survey response, and I did this about 15 years.
Hold on, Dave. You have to talk into this thing.
Survey response. My favorite survey my favorite survey response was, we now call it the Donald Trump response, but my favorite survey response was many years ago on water quality practices, water conservation practices. This was in the early 1990s. I got the survey back. I have it hung on my office wall. It says, "None of your GD business." And that's my.
I just wanted to add to Noah's question about non-significant results. I mean, sometimes it's exactly what you need and want to know is things that aren't related to whatever. And your simple example of autism and organic food. I mean, you would want to establish perhaps that the two are not linked.
Well, yeah. But also, you have to be careful, too, that these results start confirming what you already have as biases in terms of you being a researcher. So there's a relationship, the bias in the researcher and the bias in who you're measuring. We have to make sure that we maintain a proper critical attitude about how the information's coming to us. Yep.
But the comment was just saying basically sometimes there's information contained in that non-significant result.